On the 25th of September 1529, for the first time, an Ottoman army arrived at the Austrian capital of Vienna. Their arrival marked the beginning of a siege characterized by subterranean warfare, nasty weather, and serious supply problems. The siege of Vienna was rather short, but it was, without a doubt, an event of pan-European importance. It ended the perceived invincibility that had surrounded the Ottoman army just when it had come closer to Central Europe than ever before. For centuries, this event had extraordinary symbolic power, but it is now overshadowed by the Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna in 1683. In this video, we present the story of the First Ottoman Siege of Vienna, which was no less staggering than the second one. And, as anyone can imagine, it would have made the Ottomans' lives tremendously easier if they could have walked straight through the gates of Vienna. Such coups de mains were not uncommon back then, and neither are they today, as many people's passwords are less than ideal. Here, NordPass, a secure password manager created by cybersecurity experts, comes in. NordPass is the sponsor of this video. If you ever chose the name of your local football team, your own name, or 123456 as a password, then you're in good company. Because, as recent studies indicate, that is literally what thousands of people all across the world do as well. For us, there are a couple of reasons to use NordPass. Prime amongst them is that their password manager generates secure passwords for us and remembers them. This in turn allows us to log in, browse, and even shop faster, which is essential for us as we're basically working on our computers all day. We work on this YouTube project a lot, so saving time literally translates to a more effective workflow and thus more time with friends and family. Make your life easier and more secure as well. Get an exclusive NordPass deal plus 1 additional month for free by using our link, which you can find in the description box or the pinned comment. All of this is risk-free, as NordPass offers a 30-day money-back guarantee. Now, let's jump back to the video. In 1520, Suleiman I rose to the throne of the Ottoman Empire. He followed in the footsteps of his great-grandfather Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, and soon showed ambitions to expand the realm. In 1521, Suleiman conquered the Hungarian border fortress of Belgrade, and in 1526 he crushingly defeated the Hungarians at the famous Battle of Mohacs. Though after this victory, the Sultan and his army returned home without actively occupying the territory, leaving the defeated Hungarian kingdom to its own devices. Among the many who died in the Battle of Mohacs was the Hungarian king Lajos II. Lajos had no children, but he had made an arrangement with Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, soon to be Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. In accordance with their agreement, Ferdinand was going to inherit the crown of Hungary after Lajos' death. However, not everyone was fine with that. János Apolya, the voivode of Transylvania, had himself crowned King of Hungary in late 1526, and about a month later, Ferdinand did the same. Ferdinand could not leave this lack of respect unanswered, and sent a force of mercenaries to Hungary in 1527. By early 1528, he had expelled his rival from the country. But there was a catch. Zapolya, who had fled to Poland, offered to Suleiman to rule Hungary as his vassal. In return, the Sultan would recognize him as King of Hungary and offer military support. After long negotiations, the Sultan agreed to this welcome proposal. In 1529, Suleiman and his army marched to Hungary to permanently occupy his latest acquisition. Ferdinand, who had insisted Hungary was his, warned the imperial diet of the Holy Roman Empire that Suleiman surely wouldn't stop at the border of the empire. According to the historian Klaus Peter Matschke, he was constantly looking for help all around Europe, not economizing on richly embroidered horror stories of the merciless Turk ravaging Hungary. But despite his propaganda, most European rulers remained skeptical and thought an invasion of the Holy Roman Empire was impossible. The general opinion was that after all, Hungary was Ferdinand's own problem. All the imperial diet granted was some money, 20,000 infantrymen and 4,000 horsemen to defend the territory of the border of the empire. These troops were commanded by Frederick II, Count Palatine of the Rhine. When the Ottomans were entering Hungary in summer of 1529, Ferdinand realized that he wouldn't be able to gather enough men in time to put a stop to their movement. He bit the bullet and sent an offer for truce to the Sultan. In exchange for annual gifts, all weapons should rest for 10 years. However, Ferdinand's insight came too late, and his offer was way too sparse to sway a man at the head of a marching army. Soon, the Ottomans reached the fields of Mohacs, where they held a pompous ceremony, a signal of the Sultan's power to all of Europe. Zapolia was officially made an Ottoman vassal on this occasion. In early September, they conquered Buda and installed Zapolia on the throne as their puppet king. Then, the Ottoman Sultan and his Hungarian petty king, together, just as Ferdinand had feared, marched along the Danube to Komárom, Győr, and Bratislava. It was soon clear to everyone that indeed, the Ottomans were marching for Vienna. Vienna was situated at the eastern border of the Holy Roman Empire at the confluence of the Danube and the river Wien, and thus well protected from north and east. Yet its defenses were far from formidable. The medieval walls were old and brittle, and completely lacked modern bastions. In the 15th century, some improvements had been made, but there had never been a major modernization. After Mohacs, the gates were reinforced with bulwarks, and in summer of 1529 the suburbs were secured. However, according to the Viennese historian Günther Dürriegel, this was a, quote, failed attempt to improvise, end quote. Most of these new outer line of defense consisted of wooden fences. At best, this might stop a cavalry charge. Small walls or wooden palisades were only built near the eastern gates. Because there is no proper map from the city of that time, all we know about the defenses had to be tediously reconstructed from written sources and contemporary depictions. The resulting maps, however, are stored away in academic literature and not easily accessible. This is why some other YouTubers and even some scholars made the odd choice of using one of the numerous later maps that deceivingly depict the town with bastions, often even the one of 1683. Our map is based on a reconstruction by two well-known Austrian historians, Walter Hummelberger and Kurt Pebal, two authorities on this topic. Already in May, Ferdinand had put the military command of the city's defense into the most trusted hands, the hands of the field captain Nicholas, Count of Salm. Seeing the state of the defenses and the few men at his disposal, this experienced warrior fundamentally doubted whether Vienna was defensible at all. The men were too few, the attackers too many, the defenses in too bad a shape, and the time to change any of these facts too short. Even before Ferdinand, who was residing in Linz, could react to Nicholas's concern, the Ottomans closed in on Vienna. At the time, nobody knew whether the city could resist. The first herald of the Ottoman army that could be seen by the disgruntled defenders of Vienna were about 20 to 30,000 Akinji. These irregular light cavalry units prepared the ground for the main army by plundering, burning, and killing. Word of their gruesome work caused masses of people to flee Vienna. According to a mustering on the 17th of September, only 400 of the 3,500 inhabitants fit for military service remained in Vienna. The rest had already fled. By the 20th of September, no more than 12,000 trained infantrymen and 2,600 cavalrymen garrisoned the town. Some of these troops had been sent by the towns of Austria, but most were mercenaries, Hungarians, Germans, and some 700 Spanish arquebusiers. They were significantly outnumbered by the approaching army, which, according to the expert on the siege of Vienna, Günther Dürriegel, numbered about 150,000, of which 100 to 120,000 were fighting men. Once the defenders had realized this, they abandoned the large suburbs and burned them down. Then they had a range of pressing tasks to fulfill. They had to stock supplies, reinforce the walls, and build lower walls as a second line of defense behind the most vulnerable southern defenses. In addition, they built wooden artillery platforms behind the walls and unroofed some buildings for the same purpose. On top of that, they now paid the price for using the ditch as a garbage dump for the last decades. It was almost leveled and had to be cleaned out in what had to be very laborious and rather disgusting work. Not exactly pleasant too, it must have felt when they had to burn the 28 boats of their flotilla, because they were of no use without their crews. They had fled Vienna as well. The only thing that went right for the defenders at this stage was that the Ottomans were slowed down by heavy rainfalls, which turned the streets towards Vienna into swamps and small rivulets into impassable obstacles. This won the defenders the time they direly needed. Nicholas of Salm knew that the weather was Vienna's best ally. Only continuous rainfall, an early onset of winter, and an Ottoman food shortage combined could weaken the attackers enough, or even force them to leave. A lot of rain was quite common at that time of the year, and according to the expert on siege warfare Christopher Duffy, the Ottoman supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. So Nicholas's hopes were not unrealistic at all. In addition, Ferdinand was still working hard to put a relief army together. But the question remained: would the few men be able to hold the old walls long enough? Vienna's odds improved slightly when about 5,000 imperial troops and 100 heavy cavalry under Philip the Contentious arrived shortly before the Ottomans closed their grip on the town. But even so, the defenders were still significantly outnumbered and outgunned. The role of Philip has been de-emphasized by scholars over the course of the last years. It was indeed thanks to his efforts that a part of the imperial troops reached the city, and he stayed to help in the defense voluntarily. According to Günther Düriegel, he and the Count of Salm were congenial partners in the defense of Vienna. Meanwhile, Suleiman let the rear of the main army catch up near the river Leitha. The advance guard consisted of Sipahi, the professional Ottoman cavalry. They reached Vienna on the 23rd of September. On the same day, 500 heavy Austrian cavalrymen set out from the city to weaken the arriving vanguard before it could settle down. They were devastatingly repelled by the Akinji and the Sipahi near the monastery of St. Nicholas, and some of them were taken prisoner. 5 of these prisoners were given gifts and rich clothes in the Ottoman camp, and sent back to Vienna with an appeal for surrender. Vienna left it unanswered. The main Ottoman army arrived on the 25th of September, and one day later, still in pouring rain, the Sultan took up quarters in his opulent tent near Ebersdorf. By the 27th of September, a sea of Ottoman tents stretched around Vienna in a wide semicircle, closing the city completely off from the land side. The ring was completed by the Danube flotilla, which had successfully set the 3 bridges over the river on fire. Receiving these news, the rest of the imperial troops under Philip's uncle Frederick stopped their march for Vienna and returned to Krems. Vienna was cut off completely. The Ottomans quickly installed their batteries and built their siege positions. This was quite easy for them because the defenders had not leveled the suburbs completely. Some houses and stretches of the fences were even fully intact. Because the suburbs stretched all the way to the city walls, they provided welcome cover to the attackers. To prevent them from taking hold, Nicholas of Salm ordered several sorties. On the 27th and 28th of September respectively, 1,000 infantrymen surprised the Ottomans who were establishing their positions in the suburbs and inflicted heavy casualties. A third major attempt, on the 29th of September, failed because it was detected early. Meanwhile, the Ottoman artillery was thoroughly testing the city walls. However, due to the muddy streets, the Ottomans had been forced to abandon all but 2 of their large guns on the march to Vienna. so that for the most part they only had small and medium caliber artillery, which was not very effective, not even against the old walls of Vienna. Thus, all they could do was putting up an ongoing barrage at the battlements and the town itself. The two large guns were installed in a battery opposite the Kärntner Gate, which they tried to breach. Because they observed that their guns were failing, the Ottomans held a council of war on the 1st of October. The Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who had commanded the army as Serasker, presented his plan to Süleyman. He proposed to bank primarily on their capable miners and direct their attack against the Kärntner Gate and the adjoining sections of wall. Once a mine would breach it, their 20,000 Janissaries, the Ottoman elite infantry, could storm in. The Sultan agreed, but there was a problem: the ongoing rain. Any tunnel or trench was filled quickly with water, which made mining virtually impossible. However, 3 days later, the weather changed. The rain stopped, and the Ottoman workers took to the shovels. The defenders were clueless and still worried about the enemy positions in the suburbs when a Christian defector told them what was going on beneath the ruins. The Ottomans were working on 5 separate mine tunnels. Salm quickly recovered from the shocking news, sent listening posts to the cellars, and established assembly places near the Kärntner Tower. But most importantly, he and Philip ordered additional sorties to destroy the entrances of the tunnels. These were successful at first, but as the Janissaries were gaining a better foothold in the suburbs, it became increasingly more difficult to get to the mines. The last and largest of these sorties took place on the 6th of October. Almost half of the defenders set out for the Ottoman positions. But they were discovered early and lost the advantage of initiative. The Ottoman counterattack caught them on the wrong foot, and in no time, the sallying force got into disorder and retreated. More than 500 of the retreating men were slaughtered when the guards panicked and closed a gate too early. After this, the commander abstained from further sorties. Instead, they deployed a number of Tyrolean miners who happened to be in the city. Those experienced mine workers placed vessels of water near the defenses, which mirrored any convulsion. When they detected a tunnel, they quickly picked up their own tools and dug a countermine to neutralize the Ottoman mines by destroying them, by cleaning out the powder charges or weakening the seal so that the energy could spread. When two groups of miners met in the tunnels, extraordinarily brutal fights ensued in the muddy darkness underground. Only melee weapons could be used because firearms would have caused the mines to explode, and thus the men stabbed and clubbed each other dead. Eye to eye, they wrestled for their lives and those of their brothers above them. The Ottomans were determined to take Vienna quickly, and they were under pressure to do so. Winter was imminent, and discipline and morale in their camp deteriorated quickly. In addition, they feared that Ferdinand or Frederick would arrive with a large relief force. Because of this, they ceaselessly worked to get to the walls. The defenders, who were trying to prevent exactly that, couldn't keep them away. On the 9th of October, the first 2 mines exploded west of the Kärntner Gate and made 2 breaches of about 25 meters each. The Janissaries immediately advanced and tried to storm it. However, they forgot to attack elsewhere too, so that the defenders could focus all their forces at the 2 breaches. Their counterattack was led by Count of Salm himself. It was the last time the experienced fighter led his men from the front. He was wounded in the thigh in the dense melee. Despite their leader being wounded, the defenders managed to push the Janissaries back. The ongoing Ottoman artillery fire, the long shifts on guard, and the physical work involved in repairing the defenses, as well as in barring breaches, wore heavily on the defenders and the townspeople who had stayed. The situation deteriorated more and more, until on the 11th of October, they sent a desperate letter to Frederick II, who was still encamped near Krems. Quote, "From hour to hour, the defenders become fewer and weaker. Please hurry to come to our help. Do not wait any longer." End quote. The Ottomans gave the defenders of Vienna no break. They dealt their next blow on the very day the Viennese messenger left the town. This time, the Ottomans struck east of the Kärntner Gate. However, the Tyrolean miners had dug ventiducts and cleaned out the explosives of some tunnels. Because of this, the mines were much less effective. The hole they made was about 30 meters wide, but not a full breach. The top of the wall, including the battlements, stayed intact. Still, the Janissaries attacked this dismal gate in 3 waves. But the defenders stood strong, and after a long and bloody struggle, the ground was littered with bodies. When the last Janissaries retreated, the defenders counted about 1,000 dead Ottomans in the ditch. This renewed success lifted the mood of the Viennese. They were now confident that they could hold out until a relief army, or winter, would arrive. The lookout on St. Stephen's Cathedral even reported he had already seen fire signals on a nearby mountain, the Bisamberg. But the Ottomans weren't done yet. The day after, in mid-morning, the explosion of several mines east of the Kärntner Tower announced a third assault. But again, the Tyroleans had done a good job, and therefore the damage was not too bad. The attack could be repelled easily by the infantry and the arquebusiers at the breach. What really hurt the defenders was something else. The Ottoman guns destroyed the parapets of the most crucial artillery positions at the Kärntner Tower, so that they had to be abandoned. This reduced the Viennese's meager firepower even more. In the afternoon, the Ottoman miners brought down a piece of wall between the 2 first breaches west of the tower, which had been bared by the defenders. Before the dust settled, 3 columns of attackers were throwing themselves at the breach. With their artillery badly weakened and their defenses opened up, it seemed like the Viennese wouldn't be able to hold it off. But somehow the defenders still stood up to the Janissaries, and after a drawn-out fight, with their last ounce of strength, repelled them yet again. Although they were completely exhausted after this day of fighting, the defenders filled in the breach as best they could and built new, improvised parapets on the destroyed artillery positions. Vienna had survived another day. Salm and Philip, however, were anything but calm and content. How many assaults on this dangerously wide breach could the shrinking numbers of defenders repel? The only hope was help from outside. But there was no substantial relief army on its way, and Frederick was not yet on the Bisamberg. To the contrary, he was still encamped at Krems, and would stay there until the Ottomans were gone. Vienna was on the verge of breaking. What the defenders didn't know was that the Ottomans were almost as desperate as themselves. According to the historian Klaus-Jürgen Bremm, the situation in the siege camp worsened from day to day. They had suffered heavy losses in each assault, morale was low, and food was becoming critically scarce. The supply lines were now overstretched, and the foraging troops had to ride ever further to gather the bare minimum of food in the depopulated and plundered hinterland. In addition, the imminent onset of winter and the expected arrival of a relief army hung over the Ottoman tents like dark clouds. Against this backdrop, the Grand Vizier called a council of war. The Ottomans decided that the situation was no longer bearable. It was high time they went all in. The final assault was scheduled for the 14th of October. On the day before, the Ottoman camp was busy with industrious movement. In plain sight of the defenders, the soldiers prepared themselves. Heralds promised generous gifts, and the Sultan himself inspected the damaged walls, expressing his satisfaction with the progress thus far. These open preparations were an adept act of psychological warfare. The Ottomans were proverbially sharpening the executioner's axe, and the defenders, those to be executed, watched in fear. While the sun was rising above St. Stephen's Cathedral, 3 Ottoman attack columns formed up in front of the Kantna Gate. The defenders thought their last hour had come. However, when the first waves of attackers reached the breaches, they were repelled quite easily. This unexpected success is usually explained by the lack of motivation on the side of the Ottoman soldiers, especially the Janissaries. Some sources even claim that they had to be driven forward by their officers by force. Only in the afternoon did the Janissaries seem to have found their usual grit. Then, another set of mines widened the breach west of the Kantna Gate to about 80 meters. This was a catastrophe for the defenders, because the wide front gave them a significant disadvantage. They mobilized all reserves. Even the heavy cavalrymen dismounted and joined the rows of the common infantry. With a last, supreme effort, they braced themselves against what they surely believed would be the final Ottoman wave. But they stood firm, and after a desperate struggle, the Ottoman tide receded, leaving hundreds of bodies at the gates of Vienna. On the very same evening, the Serasker had to acknowledge the defeat. His men had failed. Vienna prevailed. On the 16th of October, the Ottomans broke camp. They massacred those prisoners of war who couldn't be taken away as slaves, about 2,000 in total, and left for the Hungarian border. When the rearguard, including the Grand Vizier, left the Vienna back 2 days later, the first snowflakes tumbled from the cloudy sky. Winter had come. Sultan Süleyman glossed over the embarrassing defeat of his elite troops and even paid them the rewards promised for a victory. He announced that he would exercise mercy with the people of Vienna because he had learned that King Ferdinand was not present, and sent messengers to his allies proclaiming the campaign had been a success. That was more than a favorable way to put it. In this manner, the Sultan disguised the worst defeat of what was to be a long career as an act of mercy. Now that everything was over, Frederick and the imperial troops marched to Vienna. As anyone could imagine, they were not received with a warm welcome by those who had fought for the city with their own lives on the line. On the morning of the 21st of October, Frederick and the Viennese Council of War decided to pay and discharge the men. However, Frederick's mercenaries demanded to be paid as if they had participated in the siege, a price their lords were obviously not willing to pay. Receiving this answer, the enraged mercenaries started a riot which lasted for about a fortnight. The victory of Vienna against the Ottoman army wasn't exploited much at first. Some light cavalry pursued the Ottomans and indeed managed to liberate multiple groups of prisoners. Because the imperial troops had no permission to cross the borders of the empire, nobody took advantage of the Ottomans' weak moment. The only measure taken was the occupation of some crucial strongholds along the eastern border under the supervision of Nicholas of Salm. Still busy with this task, the defender of Vienna died from the injury he had suffered during the siege half a year later in May of 1530. Regarding Hungary, the question at the root of this conflict, Suleiman the Magnificent had achieved his primary goal and secured the power of his vassal Zapolia. His second goal, the conquest of Vienna, however, the Sultan had failed. In the long run, this was of great importance. The siege of Vienna had been closely observed all over Europe. When Suleiman's army left, the nimbus of invincibility that had followed the Ottoman army wherever it had gone left with it. Word of their defeat spread like wildfire, and all of Europe exhaled in relief.